Welcome to Remnants. I'm Emily.
And I'm Kayla.
And today we are joined by Michael from Show Me Murder for a really special episode. And we always look at each other when we're recording because we're never on video. So
yeah, I know now I gotta
just prepare to have us never look at you. We're just going to be looking at each other the whole time. It's going to be really awkward. Just going to force my head forward.
I love it. I love it.
So today we're going to be talking about the Missouri State Penitentiary. We haven't been there yet, but we're going to be there
soon.
2 months?
No.
No?
Well,
I have no concept.
month and a half.
I have no concept of time anymore.
Yeah.
It's just sometime. I don't
Everything
know.
always feels like it's 2 months away.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
I just usually say 2 months, and then sometimes I'm right. All right.
So where do you want to begin?
That's a great question.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your podcast and your involvement with Missouri State Penitentiary, a little bit about your background?
Sure. And that's fair. Because I guess my podcast really came about because of Missouri State Penitentiary. So I moved to Jeff City in 2011, and I knew a couple of the people who were doing the paranormal tours that had just started at MSP. They'd been doing history tours for a couple of years. Anyway, they told me they needed some new tour guides, and I got my application in and been doing tours there ever since. July will be 13 years that I've been a tour guide there.
That's awesome.
I wasn't, after 2016, I wasn't in radio anymore, and I was kind of looking, I'd always toyed with the idea of a podcast, and I wanted to do something with, frankly, this radio voice. People always notice my voice, blah, blah, blah.
The good radio voice.
But I wasn't doing anything with it. And so between that and telling history and basically true crime stories on tours for 6 years, 5-6 years at that point, I decided to start this podcast. So that really did spin off MSP, although I didn't want it to be just an MSP podcast.
Yeah.
But most of my episodes have some tie to the prison, whether I want them to or not.
I
So it kind of
missed
is.
that with how many people went there.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, you couldn't really for many years, you couldn't commit a crime in Missouri without winding up there at some point.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it a couple times on different episodes, there's a tie to
I know, when we go investigate, we'll just...
Well, and I told you two this. I think both of you saw this message, but I was listening to your podcast when I was walking one day last summer.
Yeah.
During my lunch break, I take walks around town, and I was walking across the spot where the dining hall used to be, right as you were describing Charles Ray Hatcher killing an inmate at the loading dock at the dining hall. And it was just an eerie coincidence for me, I guess, synchronicity, whatever you want to call it. But
yeah.
That's but I like that. I'm glad that happened.
Yeah. Good segue there. Anyway. So yeah, the podcast really did spin off of that, and it's very history heavy. It's not for everybody. It's very, you got to like the long form Tolkien style writing if you want to listen to my podcast, but
yeah,
it's how I want to do it.
Yeah. Which is a good form. I know our format's a little bit more.
It's a little all over the place.
Kayla wants to do it, and then I just come and ruin it for her.
I think we've got a little bit there for everyone.
A little bit. And then I just have to interrupt you at some point.
You want to just, I don't know, kind of jump into, I don't know, what you kind of maybe say on your tours, like the history of MSP and...
Yeah, well, maybe go over some of the basics. Took its first inmate in 1836. I always try to put stuff in perspective. So when that prison opened, there were Native American villages within walking distance of the prison.
Wow.
And not easy walking distance, but you could have walked to one of them, with Native Americans living as they'd lived for hundreds of years. Everything west of Missouri was still territories or Mexico. I recently started throwing this factoid in. Samuel Clemens was 99 days old up in Florida, Missouri. Mark Twain was 99 days old. In the same week that inmate number 1 arrived is the week that the Alamo fell in Texas. Because I really want people to understand it was a completely different world in society when that prison opened.
Yeah. I mean, Kansas City wasn't even a town yet until the 1850s, I think.
Right. And that's part of the reason. So the prison was put in Jefferson City to keep the capital in Jeff City. The governor and the lawmakers had created Jefferson City to be the state capital they wanted a central location in the state. But once they got here, there was no rail system. Of course, there's no highway system. There's no bridge across the river. As recent, I've seen photos from as recently as the 1890s. There were still cattle being raised within 3 blocks of the state capitol.
Oh my gosh.
It was this tiny little rural town out in the middle of nowhere.
With this massive prison.
Yeah,
Right.
like
I
this-
think we're still
yeah.
the fifth. I think Jeff City is still the 5th smallest state capital in the nation.
Huh.
And so many of the lawmakers immediately, what are we doing here? Let's move back to the St. Louis area, some big city. And there were efforts, well into the 1900s to move the capital. But the prison was put here in order to, have another major state facility here, grow the town's population a little bit, and make a better argument for this being the capital. Almost didn't happen. The House at the time, many of the legislators wanting to move the capital, that bill only cleared the state house at the time by 1 vote, is how close it came to the prison not being here.
Wow.
But that's why the prison is here, is to keep the capital in Jeff City.
Guess it works.
Yeah, as I like to say it, it's worked so far.
Yeah.
But the population grew exponentially. I was going over some of the population data today. Me and one of my fellow guides were talking about this. Started that first year, 17 prisoners. By the second year, it was overpopulated. It was 41-man cells, and they had more than 40 inmates halfway through 1837.
Wow.
And really, from there on, it was overpopulated. When what did it used to be called? The Department of Penal Institutions became the Department of Corrections in 1940. And when it did, they stopped updating this document that, Kayla, you would appreciate. Historians love a nice, neat,
Yes.
it's rows of columns, nice, neat columns, and it's number of inmates received, a number of inmates discharged. And they stopped updating that in 1940. And I think, can I say pisses me off on this podcast? It pissed me off.
Yes. Yeah.
So after 1940, I don't have a hard number of any of those things.
Wow.
Here and there, I can find, the annual population total on a given day, but I can't tell you how many escaped after. But my point is, by 1940, that prison had held, I want to say it's more than 90,000 inmates, cumulative,
Wow. Yeah.
going all the way back to 1836.
And about 100-year history.
Yeah. It's easy to imagine if we continue that rate out, it'd be like 129,000, but there's no way to know. I mean, for example, more prisons came online after the 30s. So maybe that number, that would have that number go down, but then you have things like the war on drugs come along, and that would have that number going up. So where did it finally land by 2004 when it closed? If I had to guess, I'd say probably 150 to 170,000 inmates came through that prison before it closed in 2004. But that's just supposition.
And it's
I'm
still,
actually digging into that now.
yeah,
But
it still blows my mind to think that it was opened that recently. Like, I know it's not that recent anymore, but in my head, I'm always like, oh, it was.
I can't wait. If you think that now, I can't wait for you to see the inside of A Hall, the 1868 building, because there were still inmates in that building in 2004.
Now, was it a wide range of inmates, like from petty crimes to serious, or did that
It
change?
was everything. It was, for 97 years, it was the only prison in the state. Now, there was a boys' home in Boonville, and there were 2 girls' homes for some adolescents by that time. But even then, I mean, there was still a 14, 15, 17-year-old kids were still coming there well into the 40s and 50s. The youngest I know of was a 13-year-old in 1940s.
Damn.
But it was everything from petty crime to serial murder, serial rape, and sometimes they'd be in the same cell together, let alone the same building together. And it wasn't just Missouri inmates. Federal prisoners were often there, especially when everything west was territories. A couple of inmates we know of came from Alaska.
Damn.
But really, if you did anything west of Missouri and it wasn't a hanging offense, that was the closest place to send you. A lot of federal prisoners came. A lot of the women who were there over the years, Missouri State Penitentiary held women until, I would say, 1926. I could get into the weeds on that, but they were outside the wall after 1926. But for example, in the 19-teens, federal government still had no women's prison. And so women would go to whatever state had a women's cell block and was the lowest bidder. And a couple of our more famous inmates came there in the teens because they were federal female prisoners and wound up there.
Wow.
So, yeah, a little bit of everything over the years. I don't know if I should just keep rambling or let you keep asking me
Yeah,
questions.
keep rambling. I love it.
Yeah.
I do too.
Um,
You say it like that.
Maybe a little bit of what's going on at the site now, just
Yeah.
for people that don't know, because so there was a master plan put into place, excuse me. I talk for a living. Put into place before the prison ever closed of basically what to save, what to keep. And people ask me all the time, why is any of it being torn down? History nut, I would love to see it all just like it was the day they left. But it's state property, it's prime real estate in the middle of town, it's liability, it's bills, blah, blah, blah. I get it. I'm glad we're saving what we are. I wish they hadn't ever torn it. And there's people in state government that would tear it all down right now if they could. But I'm glad we're saving what we are.
Yeah.
But just in recent months, they've taken down a factory building that dated, it's hard to tell, but it's certainly dated to the 1890s. And one wall of it had fallen down. Tornadoes damaged that and a couple of other buildings, a tornado in 2019. So, I mean, even if somebody was making an effort to save it, it would have been millions of dollars. So that came down just in the last couple of months. By the time you all take your overnight, there's another housing unit from the 30s that will probably be down or be being torn down. And again, it was heavily damaged by a tornado. The 4 buildings that we see on the tours will be saved. That's the long-term plan right now. And so that's a 1905 building, housing unit 1, a 1914 to 16 building that is housing unit 3, McClung Hall. A Hall is the 1868 building, 4 house. That one's expected to be saved, and the gas chamber. And the gas chamber, there have been plans over the years, and I don't know where they've landed on this, to move the gas chamber because it's
far, right?
without being able to show you a map or show our viewers a picture. Suffice to say, it's down the hill on the back of the property, and it's a significant distance away from the other buildings, the other cell blocks, which was by design.
Sure.
Yeah.
But as other parts of the property being reclaimed, there's a plan to potentially move that up to a site closer to the cell blocks. So contextually, historically, taking it out of context, yeah, that sends up flags for me, but if it's that or lose it altogether, and it probably makes more sense than, there may be fast food joints down there someday, which I guess most people don't want to eat at the
No.
Taco Bell next to the gas chamber.
I
Make
don't
what
know.
jokes you
Although, would
will
you want
about
to eat at the
that,
Taco
but
Bell that's sitting on a former where the gas chamber was?
they've been talking about everything from who wouldn't love to stay at a hotel built on the side of a former prison? I mean, some people would balk at that. I think it'd be brilliant. I think turn one of the cell blocks into a B&B, but
Oh, we'd be there.
Yeah.
I'm also broke, so I can't be the one doing it.
Gas chamber though, so.
But that's kind of what's been going on recently. And then the other thing, Kayla and I were chatting about this earlier about, potential places for you all to stay while you're in Jeff City.
Yeah.
A lot of the buildings around Jefferson City were tied to that prison. Many of them belonged to the wealthy business owners who used the inmate labor.
Okay.
Many of them belonged to the wardens or the superintendents running those factories. But, carry that out. I mean, there are sites literally all over the state of Missouri that were tied to that prison. And the connections to that prison go even beyond that. We were talking about inmates from all over what today is the United States, all the way up into Alaska. This prison has ties certainly all over the U.S. and probably beyond. I think it's safe to say it's got ties to other parts of the globe as well.
Yeah, I imagine.
Was it? I'm like probably getting way ahead of like famous stories or infamous stories, but
How dare you?
I know. Was the guy who killed Martin Luther King Jr., wasn't he an escaped? Did he escape
so
from MSP?
he had escaped from MSP about 11 months before Martin Luther King was murdered.
Yeah.
He'd been on the run from MSP.
Just thinking
about
it being
11
tied
months.
to like big event. I mean, I'd argue that's an almost global event.
That's certainly one of the more notable in the prison's history. I mean, as far as what one might consider, I guess contemporary is relative, but to me, that's still contemporary history, and that's probably the biggest.
Too.
Yeah. His prison transistor radio that he had bought in the prison canteen is on display at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis.
Wow.
That was one of the first clues that led them to him. And it's on display if you go down there. I did not, I toured that 2 summers ago, did not expect to see that radio.
Yeah.
With all the things that are there, I mean, they had the bullet that killed Martin Luther King, the rifle that and the whole museum is powerful in and of itself. But then that was almost kind of a personal
Yeah.
kick in the gut for
You had a
me with what I
connection.
do all summer long. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's one tie to national history right there.
Yep.
Again, I don't know if I should go on and on. I don't
I
want
mean,
to
yeah, I mean, I guess
tie.
I mean, we could talk about other
Sure.
notable
Yeah.
stories. I mean,
Yeah,
I know
like-
like Frank James was there, right? And
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sure there's
Briefly.
a lot of
Yeah.
serial
Actually,
killers. What's-
I don't think he was.
Maybe not.
Is that one of those were we talking about this before we start recording?
There's
Like misinformation out there?
there is a lot, and I'm about 75% sure he wasn't. I
Okay.
know that I can tell you for certain that there's an article. I'm trying to think where I've seen it because I thought it was legit the first time I saw it, but turns out it's a fictional account of him being an MSP and he's having an interaction with another guy. Excuse me, another guy. But I can't remember now where I saw it or what the context was. But I can tell you that story is fiction.
Okay.
I'm inclined to say he never actually did time in MSP, but now I'm not. As I say it, I'm not certain of that.
Yeah, that's all
But
right.
I do know there's a fictional account of him being there.
Yeah. I feel like
but
I saw
that's
Jesse James.
Yeah, and then the
house,
governor
yeah.
released him, but
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know how true.
I know Jesse James was never there, but Frank
Yeah.
James. Now I suddenly want to look that up.
Yeah.
But he's maybe a good example of the time frame because we talk about James Earl Ray, we talk about Pretty Boy Floyd, we talk about Sonny Liston, but there are a lot of people who were there 1800s who today nobody remembers, but they were famous in their day.
Mhm.
John Reno, the Reno gang was credited with the first train robbery in the United States. If you look chronologically, it wasn't the first, but it was up there. It was close. But his gang was credited with the first train robbery. He was in MSP for many years. There's an example of somebody who was famous in their day. I'm trying to think of some other example. The women who I mentioned who were there in the 19 teens, there ought to be a book and a movie about Kate Richards O'Hare. Kate Richards O'Hare went from being a prisoner at MSP to being the assistant director of the California penal system later in life.
Wow.
She started out as a socialist, and she was sent to MSP for what today would be freedom of speech. She was speaking out against the war effort in World War I, which then was a violation of the Sedition Act. Because of what she saw in MSP, she started focusing more and more on prison reform after her time there and became an activist more and more, but less about socialism, although she was still passionate about it, and more about prison reform. And she went on to be a director in the California prison system, largely because of what she experienced while she was in MSP.
That's amazing.
If there's,
Especially for the
I think there'll be, I
Yeah.
really do think there should be a movie about her, but today nobody knows who the heck she is.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
I hadn't heard of her, but
I hadn't either.
I want to look up more about her now.
I know.
Yeah. And then of course there's the shall we say more infamous inmates like Charles Ray Hatcher,
Mhm.
who we talked about. You all did an episode, didn't you, on Bob
Yeah.
Berdella?
Yeah,
He
we
died at MSP. Bob Berdella, you asked before about the caliber of inmates who was there. The section Bob Berdella was in, it was, let's see, that was 91. So I think it's still fair to say that was general population. You know, Bob Berdella he was convicted of 6 murders, right? But
Yeah.
he was in general population at MSP.
Wow.
So a fair example of how, again, you were just kind of thrown in there sometimes with other inmates who were far more or far less violent than you were.
I can't
A lot, when people describe prisons as a college for criminals, I mean, MSP's, I don't think there's a better example than that.
Well, there are a lot of inmates that came back, like they got released,
Yeah, I don't have the numbers memorized off the top of my head, but there's
nowhere else to go and they commit crime.
Well, and some guys don't, once they get out in public, they don't know how to survive if they've been in there, even, in those days, even 5-10 years. but there was a couple of guys. Dutch Charlie was one who I want to say he was in and out of MSP like 12 or 15 times. I need to look it up again. It's in one of Mark Schreiber's books.
Remember?
But yeah, he came, but there were a couple of guys that I read about over the years who were in and out of MSP 10 and 12 times.
God.
And there was a time, we hear of life sentences and not necessarily always meaning literal life.
Mhm.
There was a time when if you had survived 14 years at MSP, that was considered a life sentence. That was the nature of existing in that prison.
Yeah.
Whether that be the violence among the inmates, the, literal rats and diseases that would run rampant through there, bucket plumbing, no heat. There were so many things about that prison that was just, if you could live 14 years, you had done life.
Hmm.
It was very unusual at one point for a guy who, I was recently researching an inmate who, let's see, he went in 1902 and he died in 24. And he, in prison terms, was considered the oldest inmate there. Now, that's not oldest by age, that's the longest time served at MSP. And that was in 1924. 22 years was considered this long. I mean, we've got people now. I just spoke to an inmate last week. My days run together. Last week or the week before, who was in MSP in 1954, when arguably the biggest riot happened. And he's still in the prison system today. But back then, 15, 20 years was kind of unheard of.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know that.
Mhm.
That's wild.
I guess thinking of like the conditions, can you talk about like the buildings that are still standing for us to be in? Can you kind of talk about those?
No.
Like what the conditions were? Can we please
Sorry.
Can't hear anything about it.
So I'll just go kind of in order the one of how we see them on the tours. So the 1905 building faces Lafayette Street, Housing Unit 1 or H Hall. They went from a lettering system to a numbering system. Is built right up against the front of it. It was built right up against the front of its predecessor, in that it was the main entrance point to MSP and it was the admin building. Paperwork came in and out of there, a warden is housed in there, etc. It was the women's cell block from 1905 to 1926. There are 96 cells in that cell block that for those, those initial years, I'm trying to remember MSP at its most, and this would have been before they stopped holding federal female prisoners, had 120 to 130 women. And so that would have been in that building. But for a large part of that building's life, it was fewer than one woman to a cell. They didn't, especially after they quit doing that, it was like 60 to 80. But then it was after that, it was men for a number of years. Then it was used as basically as an intake building. That's when it was its most packed, was when it was the diagnostic center for new inmates coming to the prison system. They would be packing guys into every one of those cells, and I've heard 2 or 3 men to a cell and cots on the floor with men sleeping on floors in that building was when it was its most packed. At the time the prison closed, that cell block was the intensive therapeutic community. Think of that like an AA program, but it's drug and alcohol treatment. It was interesting to a lot of our guests. So there would be a guard station in that unit, but the treatment program was run by the inmates. There was an inmate facilitator that ran the treatment program. It was very much a boot camp environment, very military boot camp style. Like you had to make your bed every morning and stand at attention outside your cell for head count, and just a minor violation would get you thrown out. Many guys said they did it just to have something, if you're doing 40 years in there, hey, that was something different to do for 6 months. But other guys said they, actually wanted the treatment program and thought it was helpful to them. But that building at other times housed the women, it was very much self-contained for the women for many years. The women's hospital unit was in there separate from the men's hospital. I'm trying to think what else operated out of there. There was a dress out room. When you watch TV shows and movies and you're visiting your loved one on the other side of the plexiglass talking on a phone, that's in there.
Okay.
So that's kind of a rundown of what is still extent of that building. Even parts of that building are gone from what was there. But that's housing unit 1. And I'm thinking off the top of my head of a couple of murders that I know happened in there.
Okay.
Housing Unit 4 is usually the second building you see on the tour, but it's the 1868 building. Now, this is the oldest building that still stands at Missouri State Penitentiary. That building, have you been to Eastern State, or I'm sure you're familiar with Eastern State
I know of
Penitentiary?
it, but
Yeah.
yeah. I haven't been there.
Eastern State and Housing Unit 4, this is where you walk down the middle of the building and the cells are on the outside, as opposed to the other buildings, you're going to see that the cell block runs down the middle of the building.
Okay.
Need a lot fewer guards for line of sight. But it's 150, I think the couple of cells take offline. I think it's 157 cells that are considered online. Offline is like they're used for an office, or they're used for a bathroom or something like that.
Gotcha.
But that building started off 1868. There was a Union general in that building. He had been kind of a fall guy in a national whiskey tax scandal. He's got a book you can read if you want to read a firsthand account of what his time there was like, called Secrets of the Great Whiskey Ring. It's on Google Books, it's Nook, Kindle.
Kind of a cool title.
But it gives you an idea of the caliber of inmate that was in that building at the time. He was in there, I want to say, in the 1880s, but so it's still a relatively new building. You kind of get the impression that this is where we're going to put our high profile inmates, our wealthy inmates, our well-connected inmates. And I think we see that in later years too, is that they kind of put the big name inmates in some of the whatever was the latest building, the best building at the time. I'm gonna say something real quick before I carry on. I don't know when MSP became segregated. Early days, they couldn't have if they wanted to. They were overpopulated. They were doing all they could just to find cells for guys. So even if segregation was intentional, the best they could do was they'd all be in the same building, but maybe this end is the white guys, maybe this end is the African American inmates. I don't know when they truly became segregated, certainly building by building. I say all that to say that for many years, A-Hall was called the quote unquote black dorm. It's the terminology they used at the time. And during that period, conditions in there were perhaps as bad as any building at any point in that prison's history. At one point, it was up to 11 men to a cell. That is documented in reports. 11 men to in a 14 by 8 cell.
Oh my God.
1929, it would have been about 6 to 8 men to a cell, but it was still bucket plumbing. In 1920, they didn't get running water until I want to say it was 30 or 31. But yeah, there were in those time periods, there was somewhere between 12 and 1,400 African American inmates in MSP. And if they weren't a trustee or sentenced to death, they were in that building. You can imagine what a cholera outbreak or a smallpox outbreak would do in conditions like that.
Wiped out.
So as far as, there was no picnic spot in MSP, but I can't imagine, I don't think anything got as bad as Housing Unit 4 in the 30s.
Yeah.
I think those would have been the worst conditions that prison had, certainly in the last century.
Yeah.
And there were times that other buildings got as bad, but I think that's probably the best example, certainly that I can show you today.
Yeah.
That building has literal dungeon cells in it. It's not what I like to say on the tours. That's not that we didn't just call them that. That's what they were.
Yeah.
And those black darkness inside the cell, those never had running water, bucket plumbing. They would feed the inmates inside the cells once a day, one piece of bread and a cup of teacup of water in one example that we know of in another building. In that, what we've been told is there was a bucket for clean water that was just there, along with a bucket for plumbing, separate bucket for plumbing. And then they would slide cornbread through a slot in the door once a day, one piece per man, assuming your guard is even counting. Those cells, usually standard practice is probably one man, maybe 4 or 5 at a time. But I was reading an account after an uprising in the 30s, a bunch of the inmates basically refused to come out of the dining hall, were holding the dining hall in protest of the food. That account said they packed 20 men in every dungeon cell, like 20 men in each cell until they determined who the ringleaders were. That may have only been for a week or a couple of weeks at the most, but that's 20 men packed into
an
a cell.
hour in the kitchen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But that's housing unit 4. Housing unit 3 was built in the 19 teens in sections. And it housed, think of gangster period. Well, we saw a lot of, Pretty Boy Floyd did time in that building.
Yeah.
His alleged accomplice, by the way, was in the Kansas City massacre, was executed in the gas chamber. So historically, there's a lot of question whether those two were even in the state when that happened. But Adam Ricchetti was executed in the gas chamber. But Pretty Boy was there before anybody really knew who he was. But thinking, a lot of that caliber inmate originally. But then as you get into the 30s and the 50s, I mean, the 54 riot ended in that building. But that building, I think of the picture, I haven't been to Alcatraz, but the pictures I've seen kind of think of the cell blocks in Alcatraz, the ones that I've seen. There is a death row in the basement of that building. I say a death row because without going into a lot of detail, when death row didn't need to be 40, 50, 60 cells, it was in a separate building that's no longer standing. There was a time when death row only needed to be 4 or 5 cells. But when death row got to be what we think of today, guys taking 15, 20 years before their sentence is carried out.
Yeah.
And I want to say the number was right at 60 that were moved out of that prison when they moved death row to Potosi in 1989. So that's, the death row that's still there, shall we say.
Yeah.
And then below that, the unit below death row on one wing of 3 House is interesting. A couple of us among the historians of that prison, we think that unit might date back to a building from the 1840s. We think that when they tore that building down and built the new B Hall, which McClung Hall is B and C Hall, or 3A and 3B, depending on which time frame. I tend to think of the terms from the 30s and the 50s, so B Hall, C Hall. But when they tore down the old B Hall, that they left that part of that old building and then built the new McClung, new 19 teens, McClung Hall on top of it.
I mean, that would make a lot of sense
So
to use the foundation.
some of the brickwork down there and some of the cells may actually be from like the 1840s. I don't know how we would ever verify that.
Yeah.
I can say this, those cells down, the cells in that particular unit, it wasn't until like the 1980s that they knocked out the dividing wall to make 2 cells into one, because those were what I call the second generation cells in MSP. They went from those 14x8 ones like A Hall had later on in the 60s. Well, they started off with cells that size in the 1830s, and because they couldn't keep up with the inmate population, they started making the cells smaller so they could fit more in the same amount of space. That's what the cells in 3D below death row used to be, where these narrow cells. I couldn't even put my arms halfway out in that cell. It's like, I want to say it's 4 foot across. They used to all be that way until the 80s, and that was used as a punishment unit. They called it O Hall informally. But one of the cells down there is still the original dimensions, because when they did knock out the dividing wall and the others, it was the odd one out. So I'll be able to show you what those narrow cells used to be. Assuming we could have, there's another unit, I almost forgot about this. There's formerly buried cells right behind that building. The reason we might not be able to get access to them is they're between that building and housing unit 2, which is the one that I expect to come down maybe before you all are here. But that building is in such bad shape, the state who still owns the property is worried it might collapse while we've got tour guests back there. So I don't know if I can take you to them, but they were from a building called Centennial Hall, built in the 1870s. And they are those narrow cells like what I was talking about. But they were buried for, well, let's see, Centennial Hall, I think I finally narrowed it down that it was torn down by 1923. And those cells were first dug up in the 80s when they went to make rec yards for the death row inmates. They found them, nobody had remembered they were there, found them, buried them again. And then about 3 years ago, the Visitors Bureau, who I work for, had them dug back up to be added to our tours.
Okay.
So those are 1870s cells that are down there. But that's basically exposed outside. But hopefully I can take you to those.
Yeah.
And then of course the gas chamber. I'm a hit at parties talking about the gas chamber. But it was built in 1937, 40 executions done there. I'm not sure how many more were scheduled, but the guy got a reprieve, got a commutation. There were other execution, other death sentences in that time, and I don't think it's many. But the reason I bring those up is I don't know how many times somebody got walked to that building before they got a last minute stay and weren't brought back up. Now, if you're
Oh,
like
that's
me,
always true.
yeah, if you're like me and you think somebody doesn't have to die in a place to leave an impression, I mean, I wonder how many of those guys left some kind of imprint on that limestone.
Absolutely.
Personally, I know of one guy who he was said to have the mental capacity of a 9-year-old, sentenced to death, and the warden or the governor did stay his execution 7 times before they finally carried it out on the 8th time. And I don't know how many of those times he got a reprieve. Was it a last minute reprieve? Like how many times was he walked to that building thinking he is going to die? I always wonder about that, but certainly 40 executions carried out, 39 lethal gas, 1 lethal injection. And just real quick, so that building replaced hanging in the 1930s. Hanging used to be the form of execution prior to 1937, and those used to be done county by county. I know there were some. One of the last hangings in the state was at the Jackson County Courthouse, right before they started using the gas chamber.
Yeah.
But we'll certainly take you down there, and I've researched at one point or another, I've researched each of the people executed in that building. Now, how many I remember off the top of my head, not all of them, but I've got a document on those I could share with you if you want to read through them before you're here.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
That would be.
See what ones stand out to you.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a breakdown of the buildings. And then, the property itself was our shirts say bloodiest 47 acres in America. I'm not good at, I have no concept of how big an acre is, but I'm told it was actually 43, but call it 40 something acres inside the wall. That much of it still resembles obviously having been a prison, but so many of the buildings have been torn down. A lot of the factories used to be next to where the gas chamber is. You're going to see the rec yard that for years was the first rock quarry. We do believe there are still some inmates buried under the parking lot that used to be the rec yard.
I believe it. Yeah.
I can't prove it to you, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that they're there.
Yeah.
So the site in total is 40 some odd acres, and that's not counting satellite sites elsewhere in town that were connected to the prison in one way, shape, or form, rock quarries, things like that. Oh, and I almost forgot, I need to tell you about, if you can fit it into your time while you're in Jeff City, Longview Cemetery, a lot of inmates are buried there. And a couple of them I can tell you about specifically.
Okay.
Let me think. So many inmates that were buried at a different site in town were moved there in the 30s, and now Lincoln University has a library on that site. But there's a lot of them who were moved at that time, and their graves aren't marked. I can tell you where they are because of a plat of that cemetery, but there's no marker. The state was still burying inmates there into I want to say the early 2000s, but certainly into the 90s. If they died in state custody and weren't claimed by somebody, many of them wound up there. I think that Charles Ray Hatcher is actually buried there.
Oh.
I need to verify that, but I think he's there, come to think of it. Couple of guys who were executed in the gas chamber are there. But then one guy who actually many of them don't have a marker at all. They have a little stone block that might have their number on it. One guy who's actually got a tombstone is kind of a legend at MSP. And so I tell my tour guests, there's the legend and there's the story that I can show you documentation that I can research. The legend is that he was put in those dungeon cells in Four House for, it's hard to tell exactly how long. People think years. Which, if you leave somebody in K-black conditions, some in a matter of days, you'll go permanently blind. It's thought that he may have been in those cells for years because he tried to organize the prison factory labor into unions. With wealthy business owners essentially running the prison, you can imagine they didn't like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Got him thrown. I mean, we know of women being thrown in those because they missed their quotas sewing in the factories. So you can imagine him being thrown down there, years does not sound implausible to me. The legend is that he was let out at the behest of the inmates by a warden who was trying to smooth over tension at the time, and he gave them their request to let Buck out. Buck was blind, insane, and died just a couple of days later. And the legend goes on to say that the inmates paid for him to have a tombstone. They only made like, this is $19-20, $1.50 a month was all an inmate would make working in those factories. So they pooled their own money for him to have a tombstone because they wanted him to be remembered, wanted him to be honored because he had fought for them. Now that's the legend.
Yeah.
What I can show you newspaper articles, blah, 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 documentation of is that Buck McKay was a violent epileptic. I can tell you, by the way, he was a second-degree murderer. Came out of St. Louis in 1902. But the papers said he was violently epileptic. Now, I have to question whatever he had in 1902. Would we call that epilepsy today? I haven't researched that yet, whether it might have been something else. I don't know a thing about epilepsy and whether I've never heard of an epileptic person being violent, but I don't know. Maybe they are. I have no idea. But certainly that's what they called it then. And the story is that he was put in those cells, had nothing to do with trying to form unions. It was because he was so violent that it took 6 or 7 men to hold him down during his fits. He was a danger to himself and others. They didn't know what else to do with him. They sent him to Fulton State Mental Hospital and he escaped from there. 1922, he got a early release, got a early pardon, and was sent to his family in Kansas, allegedly threatened to kill his mom with an axe, and they revoked his parole and sent him back. And again, it's unclear how he may have spent those last 2 years of his life in a dungeon cell, if only because they didn't know what else to do with him. The case gained some notoriety when a former Sing Sing warden toured MSP and started publicly criticizing the conditions there, and he specifically mentioned Buck as being, having been in the dungeon cell for, at that point, it was, they threw around numbers like 7 years, things like that. I don't know if that was accurate. That was before his early parole, but that's when he gained a lot of notoriety. So the papers started from that point forward, kind of following his story a little bit. So that's why we had the legend. That's why we had the story.
Right.
I'm convinced there's truth to both, because the bottom of his tombstone, well, let me back up and say inmates were still talking about him 40, 60 some odd years after he died. Wow. His story was still being told among inmates. And there was a rallying cry of all the way with Buck McKay, wouldn't work for the state with 25 cents a day. It may have gone on and on. But across the bottom of his tombstone, it says something like all the way. I'm convinced there has to be truth somewhere in between. Right, because they clearly wanted him to be remembered.
Yeah.
So how much of the legend, how much of the story, but I'm convinced there's some truth to both. Yeah. But Buck McKay is buried in that cemetery and he has an actual tombstone.
Yeah,
so if you guys want
to go there. Oh yeah, yeah, for sure.
And I can either take you out there or I can tell you how to get there or where to find things, either way.
Cool.
We always have time for cemetery.
Yeah, we always have time. You've mentioned the 54 riot. So what happened with that?
So the 54, and I'm researching it now for an episode I hope to have out later.
Well, you can just get the basics to us then.
No, that's fine. But because the 70th anniversary of that riot is coming up in September, I'm hoping to have this new episode ready for that. It's going to focus on a murder that happened during that riot, and there's a lot of doubt about whether the right people were ever prosecuted for that murder. But the riots, there have been a number of big prison riots elsewhere in the country already in the 50s. It suddenly escapes me where, but certainly the governor at the time and other state officials, the warden, they already had kind of a heightened sense of alert that we could have this happen here. And they actually, I kind of remember that they actually started putting contingency plans in place. One of those I'll touch on here in a moment. But the 54 riot is probably and certainly arguably the biggest the prison ever had. Depends on how you define riot, dollar amount, damage, whatever, number of inmates, but probably the biggest in both regards, certainly the best documented riot. And I can't, so come to find out over the years, I'd heard both that this guy, Don DeLapp, had lured guards to his cell and then knocked one of them out. And I had heard that he played sick. Well, come to find out, both are true, because in August of that year, DeLapp did play sick, lured the guard over, overpowered him, turned everybody in the punishment hall unit that he was in loose. Hello, Kitty. I have to talk to your cats. I'm sorry.
They love it.
And they basically held the punishment unit for an amount of time until prison staff said they would, acquiesce to some of their requests. They were upset about the food and some of the other conditions. A lot of the parole board members were former highway patrolmen, former law enforcement. They didn't like that. And so that, they were basically airing their grievances, and they were told, okay, we'll answer some of your grievances. And they released control of this unit. September rolls around, their grievances still haven't been answered. This is when he'd broken a sink in his cell, got the bedding and everything wet. And when the guard comes to, he was either retrieve a mop or something to do with that, he again overpowers the guard, takes the keys. This time he doesn't stop with that unit. About 3,900 inmates at MSP in 1954. It's thought that about half of them participated in the riot. Some guys don't want to get hurt or killed. Some guys don't want time out of their sentence. I don't know how I would ever verify this. I will say it's plausible, but it's often said that no African-American inmates participated in that riot. Now, I struggle to believe that just because I don't like blanket statements.
Yeah.
And there is a picture from that next day of a bunch of African-American inmates being walked back into the building. That indicates to me they were at least out of A Hall, the building they were housed in. But that's, anyway, I don't know if I'll ever be able to verify that. But about half the inmate population rioting for up to about 18 hours. In today's dollars, it was more than $55 million worth of damage done.
Wow.
Fires that could be seen in adjacent counties, and I don't mean the smoke, I mean the flame could be seen in adjacent counties that night. So it's very likely the biggest riot that prison ever had. Not the only one by a long shot, but arguably the biggest. Here's where I think, if my memory serves, this is where I think they had, because of the other riots elsewhere in the country, I think they had already started creating contingency plan. I mean, I'm sure there's always a contingency plan, but I think they tweaked them a little bit leading up to this. But one of the first things they did was call in every highway patrolman in the state of Missouri. Every single trooper was called to Jeff City that night.
Wow.
Some of them literally burned out the engines in their cars getting here as fast as they could. And those troopers were the ones who essentially retook the prison the next day. Now, National Guard got called in. I think Kansas City and St. Louis both sent police and detectives in, but none of those entities, to my knowledge, entered the prison until it was already back under state control. So it was, I like to say it was troopers who retook the prison before these other agencies kind of came in and helped maintain control. They set up a 50 caliber machine gun on the roof of one of the buildings. In a couple of the photos, you can see that both at that riot and one in the 30s. They set up a 50 caliber machine gun on the top of the yard master's office. 4 inmates killed, and that's counting the one I told you was murdered. 60 or 70 injured, some of them by gunfire from the troopers, some of them just, fighting amongst themselves, whatnot. But that's kind of the Reader's Digest version of the 54 riot. I mean, I could go on and on, of course. And I don't mind telling you more. I mean, the murder story, I haven't even finished researching it yet, but it will be the focus of the podcast episode I'm going to release in September. But the broad strokes are...
We'll plug your episode for...
Well, that's all right.
If people want to know more.
Being cross promotion, I want people to watch, listen to both. But
Exactly.
But the broad strokes of that are the guy had snitched on a number of other gang members out of St. Louis. And that's where a lot of the question comes in about the guilt of the people convicted of his murder, because guys he had snitched on who were in MSP at the time of the riot were not investigated for his murder. Be the first people I talked to. Now, my research may tell me different, but as far as I know, they weren't even questioned about his murder. But he was killed down in death row. where he had been put for safekeeping. He wasn't sentenced to death. That was just the safest unit in the prison under normal circumstances.
Yeah.
But that was one of the murders, or one of the deaths that happened in that riot. One when we know was shot by authorities retaking the prison. That essentially, that kind of signaled the end of the riot. Really, he was shot in the face with a shotgun in Three House while they were sweeping the building.
Yeah.
The other two appeared to have been killed during the course of the riot. It may have happened at a point where a bunch of inmates surged forward trying to get into the control room or the yardmaster's office, and troopers and guards who were armed opened fire. And
Yep.
probably when those other two were killed.
Yeah.
But that's just kind of the Cliff Notes version.
Yes. Do you want to move into like the paranormal side
so
of
I
it?
guess
So I mean,
I guess for like a like a pretty sharp segue.
Yeah, so
starting
let me ask you this before I start
Yeah.
talking. I don't know, and I'm one who, when I go into a location, I like to be as clean a slate as possible. So how many stories do you want to do you want details? Do you want to kind of guide me on how much you want me to talk before I spoil anything for
that's
you?
a good point. I know Emily has debated how much she wants. You've talked about that before.
Yeah, I do think clean slate is pretty good overall. Like I prefer like not knowing what to expect in some way, because then if it happens, it's a little bit more genuine versus convincing yourself.
What about instead of like specific stories, like the activity? Or do you want like totally clean slate? Like you don't want to know like this cell block, a lot of people catch screaming, or you want to be totally blank.
Maybe just like not even down to location, just very general, like this is some of the stuff people have mentioned, because we've both heard it at some point or another. Just like the general overview of some of the stuff that happens without going into like specifically this was what happens here. And then maybe like what your overall opinion on all of it is. Just kind of, I like hearing what different people think about the paranormal and kind of where they stand on it.
Then maybe after we investigate, maybe we can do like a debrief after episode with those specifics.
About any of that.
Yeah. Or we'll be like, oh my God, that's
exactly
what
I want to know. But like
what happened.
I definitely prefer places when I don't know what to expect.
I don't think we've ever gone anywhere where we don't know the story. So this would be a good experiment. So anyways.
You should be careful what you read and watch online then.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of it out there. I mean, people have been investigating it for.
I know.
Well, I don't know if it's still out there, but the old hospital before it was torn down, there's videotapes of people going through that. Now, I don't know how they got access, if they broke in or if they just knew the right person, but I envy people who got to investigate the old prison hospital before it was torn down. That had to have been amazing. But I mean, that goes back to probably prison closed in 2004. That might have been 2004 or 2005. It's been investigated for a long time, is my point.
Yeah.
So there's a lot out there. But so do you want me to talk about any of it then, or
maybe just like very, very general like overview of kind of the basic activity? Because I know we've seen enough to kind of have a good idea of that, but like without going into just like specifics or
like maybe how much of it do you think is intelligent spirits or like just residual? Or is that still too much for you?
That's fine.
Yeah.
So my perception of intelligent versus residual, I think most of what I've encountered there almost has to be intelligent. There are some things that could have just by mere coincidence, this seems like a direct response. This seems like a communication, but it would have to have been some hellacious timing for a residual, So I think there are a couple of things that have been described over the years that I think are more than likely residual. But I think the majority of what I've ever heard described is intelligent. There's one thing I want to tell you, but I don't know if it's too specific. I don't know if I should leave that off the table.
Okay, Emily, leave the room.
No,
just sit there and la 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 la.
Not even your noise canceling headphones.
I can have them. I can hear it. It's fine.
Well, we'll have this one thing.
Yeah, I can.
Well, I'm not sure if you'd consider this too specific. There's a lot of reports, if only in the last couple of years, of what I've been calling a mimic. Whether it's mimicking a voice, whether it's mimicking an appearance. Somebody will say, "Hey, I just saw you over here in this building." Well, no, I was over there. Or, you know, I, somebody isn't even on the site when someone will think they saw them, or somebody will see. It's not even limited to guides. People will, one of the guests on the tour are on a ghost hunt. It's appeared as one of them. I believe, and one of my fellow guides might not agree with this, but I believe it appeared as Mark Schreiber at one point, who I've referenced a couple of times in a photograph. It's mimicked my voice on 2 occasions that I know of.
Wow.
So, and now, if you believe in the legend of a doppelganger, it's a bad thing to meet your own doppelganger. I don't know of anybody having met an image or a voice of themselves yet. So I guess we'll
Hope
continue
that
to hope that
stays
doesn't
true.
happen. Yeah, we'll hope, knock on wood.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
But I really, in terms of what I think are, ghosts, spirits, things like that, I think it really runs the gamut. Anything I can think of. I will say, without calling out a certain other media personality by name, I don't believe anything there is demonic, no matter how much that might be touted. Personally, I've never felt threatened by anything. And I don't say this as a brag. I've never been scared by anything. The way I quantify that is I'm terrified to get on a roller coaster. I'm terrified of heights. Okay. This is my adrenaline rush. I want to see something. I want something to pull my hair. I want something to. So nothing has ever frightened me. There's been a couple of jump scare moments, but I've never like feared for my life kind of scare.
Okay.
But that's been my experience, and I think most people would agree with you. Now, one of my fellow guides has recently, she wants to start getting away from the ghost stuff, the paranormal stuff. She took a few things as maybe personally, she took them as threatening, but certainly personally speaking to her in a way that she was uncomfortable with. So I know I'm.
Do women have different experiences
Yeah,
than
'cause we
men?
hear that a lot.
I don't know if I can speak to that. And to be fair, I haven't been doing ghost hunts or ghost tours for a few years. So I'm kind of living vicariously through some of my friends who still are. I've tagged along on a number, but I can't say that I've noticed a distinction
Okay.
between men and women, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's one that I'm missing. It's funny that, we talk about hair being pulled, and you might think in a prison that certainly was mostly men for 168 years, but that's one of their favorite things to do to me. I've had my hair pulled probably 7 or 8 times.
Oh, great.
Now, draw whatever conclusions you want from that. That hey, a long-haired guy's getting his hair pulled, whatever you want to say. But
Just jealous of your locks.
that's what I like to think it is. Sure.
Yeah.
But really, any visual, audible, oral, you'll smell things in certain places. I mean, smoking hasn't been allowed on the grounds for even before the prison closed, but you'll smell cigarette or cigar smoke in places.
That would be cool to experience.
It's obviously, I assume that I'm sure that in the last 10 or 11 years, a guest or two has lit up, even though they weren't supposed to. So I can't rule that out, but
It doesn't linger that long.
Yeah.
At least at night, we should be pretty
Yeah.
pretty confident. So that was one hell of a cigarette.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, I can't, without getting into specifics, I think just about everything has popped up there at one time or the other. And again, I'm talking about stuff that at least I feel like hasn't been explained away. I mean, we try to debunk stuff in the moment. We try to debunk stuff after the fact.
I love that. Yeah.
But there have been some very compelling photos taken over the years that we haven't been able to replicate,
Yeah. I feel like one that I know a lot about, or at least have heard a lot about, it's been the shadow people and kind of people seeing that. Is that something you've encountered at all? Because I at least know that enough to
It's not ruining
I already
anything.
know that.
So I honestly am not sure. I wish I had journaled more over the years. In 13 years, I've literally had more experiences there than I can remember. And I wish I had journaled more. I can't remember if I've ever seen a shadow figure myself.
Yeah.
that I was, yeah, that's absolutely, you know, I see, you see stuff in there in the dark and you think, okay, was it or wasn't it?
It's hard to
I've
tell.
seen a photo that I found to be extremely compelling from one of the first tours this year, and I think I can find that and send it to you.
That'd be
That
awesome.
for all the world looks like a guy sticking his head out of the cell. And you can actually, it's interesting to me, see what you think as I remember it, you can tell that a camera flash is going off, but it's in the wrong direction to be creating this shadow,
Okay.
is my impression of it.
Love it.
I
Yeah.
was going somewhere with that and I can't remember what it was.
Shadow people.
Yes, doggone it. I'm so stream of consciousness and that often fails me. But yeah, shadow figures sticking their heads. That's what it was. So I just heard of an experience. If you don't mind, stop me if you don't
No,
want to
you're
hear
good. You're fine,
specific.
yeah.
So one of my fellow, he's an assistant guide, is a former guard from there.
Oh wow.
Does not believe in the paranormal. I've asked him numerous times since I met him, hey, do you ever have it? Because, you know, maybe after I've known him for a couple of years, he'll be like, okay, well, I'll tell you one thing. Never gave me any indication that he believed in it at all. Completely thought it was bunk. Had a tour group in there. I want to say this is about 3 weeks ago. And we get a lot of school groups. They bring, fourth graders when they come to tour the Capitol. About half of them or more take a tour of the prison.
Send them to the prison.
And sometimes it'll be 100, 150 kids in there at once. I don't know. I'm glad I don't have to do more of those.
I'd be scared to have to be
I
responsible.
wonder if my
all that.
school would have, we did a trip to Jeff City, but that would have been in 2002, so it was still
Right.
an active prison again.
Yeah.
Yeah, just sprint off.
So he's got this school group in there. And what I remember of the story is he and a teacher happened to be looking at the same time to see a shadow figure, and this would have been during daylight hours, lean out of a cell door frame and then lean back in. And he looks at the teacher. He's like, did you see that? You know, it was one of those, here's this devout skeptic
Oh my God.
and sees it at the same time as another person. I thought that was one of the more credible stories I've heard for a long time. Now, one thing that might quantify as a shadow figure, and I do tell this story, and again, I won't tell the whole story, but now that I was trying to remember if I'd ever seen a shadow figure. There is one thing that I don't know whether to qualify it as a shadow figure, because where it was such a dark area that even you or me standing there, it would have been little more than a silhouette.
Yeah.
Right.
But I guess I'd have to chalk it up to a shadow figure. But that was a cool experience, because by the time it went away, the entire tour group of 30 some odd people had seen it.
Wow.
Again, I could tell you the whole story, but suffice to say, about 30 people saw this before it went away.
And you don't usually hear about multiple people seeing the same thing. So that's
You're right. That's why those
yeah.
incidents stand out to me.
Mm-hmm.
My 14-year-old who claims that she can see things that, obviously other people can. I'm as psychic as a doorknob. I believe it can be done, but it ain't me. So, of course I don't doubt her at all. But she said she walked into one of the cells there. If you've ever watched the promo video that's on social media that they had me voice, you'll hear my voice on it. She's in that promo video.
Oh my God.
While we were shooting it, the director had her step into this cell, and when I give you the cue, I want you to walk out. She said she stepped in that cell, and there was like 6 or 7 people around the wall of that cell just staring at her.
Oh, wow.
And I was, she didn't freak out. I was proud of her for that. She was more fascinated by it than anything. So sounds like my daughter.
Yeah.
Like, wow, this is weird.
Yeah.
Just keep doing your job. Wow.
But yeah, in the 13 years I've been there, like I said, I've forgotten some things. A guest who was there 7 or 8 years ago will be like, "Hey, tell me that story again," and I'd forgotten it. So
I was supposed to remind you about the ghost cat.
Okay, well, it's the cat stories I have are not paranormal. Those are history stories, but I can share them with you if you want.
There's just cats.
Yeah.
Yeah, just cats.
That's even better.
Well, just briefly, one guy I know specifically, but quick way to get yourself shanked is to mess with a guy's cat. Like if a guy's got a cat, you don't mess with their cat, which that should go without saying anyway, but don't mess with a guy's cat. But Mikey the cat, there was a period, had to be in the mid-60s or so, when stuff kept popping up in cell blocks that it wasn't supposed to be. Guys in ad seg weren't supposed to have cigarettes, stuff like that. Yeah, you see where this is going. Stuff kept popping up in these areas. I didn't know how it was getting there. And Mike the cat, who was his, Mike had a rough life. He was described to me, he had like this chunk taken out of an ear, and I think they said he, one leg didn't work real well, and he kind of limped along on that. But everybody in the prison loved this. I'm sure it had been a feral stray cat that just kind of got adopted by the inmates. And he would make the rounds every day. He knew which inmates would give him a treat off their tray at lunch and which inmates would scratch him behind the ears. So he made his rounds every day. Well, he's making his rounds one day when a guard happens to notice that Mikey is wearing saddlebags. And this little tortoiseshell fur cat, as I think they told me he was tortoiseshell, they'd made these bags to match his fur.
Wow.
Like you couldn't tell until you got close up to him that he had them on. And that's how stuff was getting into places it wasn't supposed to be.
He's a smuggler.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to
Mikey got taken home by a staff member for the rest of his life. And when he finally passed, they brought him, because he was so beloved, they brought him back and buried him in MSP. And I'm told he's off to the side of Two House somewhere.
Oh.
But that's one of the more, I get asked to tell that story. I don't always tell that story on my tours, but if I don't, about half of them ask me about it.
That's incredible. Yeah, that's definitely, we're gonna have to
We
see if
may-
we can talk to
We
Mike.
may see some feral animals while you're there. About a month ago, we had 3 or 4 foxes living down by the gas chamber.
Oh.
That's how I'm gonna get lost. I'm just gonna go chase an animal and
Cute animal.
Yeah.
Oh
I
man.
don't want to ask this question. Go
Have
ahead.
you ever seen a baby skunk up close? They're adorable. I saw some of those outside of Four House one night. They look like little kittens.
Get
I was like,
Guys,
lost in a while.
there's a phantom odor.
Yeah.
Bring some tomato juice, it'll be fine.
I'm definitely more scared of roaches and spiders than ghosts. How is it bad in July, or is the prison pretty clean?
I really don't see.
Do I
It's
need
not,
to
be-
bitch
not
like
because it's
there,
clean.
but
I think there's just not a lot there
I'm
for them
scared
to
of
eat. I really,
butterflies, whatever that situation is.
I can't make any promises there.
And
What do you say, roach? I don't see a lot of roaches on the
Thank
ground.
God. Okay.
Like I said, there's
Spider.
probably not still a lot there for them to eat, but if they're there, they stay out of sight.
Good.
What was the other thing you asked about? Roaches,
Spiders.
oh yeah, there'll be spiders. The occasional snake. I don't know how you feel about snakes.
I'm
The
indifferent.
occasional bat.
Oh, I love these bats are cute.
I love
Yeah.
babies.
I love rabies.
Yeah. We can have a fun run.
Take your rabies.
But no, we've had a couple of bats in there over the years. The occasional deer has wandered up into the upper yard. Probably the safest place in the state of Missouri for a deer is in that prison.
Hopefully. Word got out.
Yeah.
Like I'm
But,
trying to think about this place.
Okay, my last question that's sort of going to be paranormal related, but since we actually have more questions, but maybe we'll just have to get them on site from you. So since we decided not to have specifics, but we're pretty low tech, but like
Man, the shade. I could taste that all the way over
Jesus
here.
Christ.
Yeah, I like to go. Well, I will like read the last chapter of a book before I start it. So
I also don't like knowing too much because then sometimes I get in my head too much if I'm expecting a specific thing. So I just rather not know. And then I'll just go there and be like, oh, I don't need to know that there's something crawling on the ceiling in this room. I have no idea. If I see it,
I just
it's
don't like
surprise.
knowing too much in general. That's like a life.
Ignorance is bliss.
Envy the stupid. They're so happy.
yeah.
That's why I'm smiling all the time.
Anyway,
Okay, we're pretty low tech, but like what's like for capturing evidence, like what do people get the most with? Like a digital recorder and just getting EVPs or taking a lot of photos and trying to get shadows? Like what's
I see a lot of shadow photos. If I see another orb photo, I don't know what I will do. I don't know how you all feel about orbs, but not a fan.
Yeah.
Now I've seen some. I will say this: I've seen some with the naked eye there, like
That would
stood
be-
there and
now
watched
that
it
would
float
be
by.
interesting.
Yeah.
Not
That I
on
would-
cam. Yeah, if you show me on camera, 9 times out of 10, there's
Dust.
no way to. Yeah,
Right.
it's just too likely that it could be dust or a bug for me to care.
Yep.
But
But
I
yeah,
have
that's not
2
true.
occasions I have seen them naked eye.
That'd be
But yeah, see lots of photos of shadow figures. So yeah, take lots of photos, roll some video.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'll be able to swing it between now and then. I would love, they make these attachments that turn your cell phone into a FLIR, a thermal camera.
I've seen those, but yeah, they're
I
like
would-
$100.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm going to try and get my hands on one of those before July if I can.
Yeah.
We've done laser grids in there, but I don't think I've ever seen anything conclusive on one of those. I
I
think
like the idea
Yeah,
of
they
them,
just
but I've
look
never
cool, but
seen
it's,
them.
it's such a great idea, but yeah, I've never seen it turn up anything. They have a couple of REM pod. The prison staff has a couple of REM pods.
That's
Sweet, 'cause we don't have one.
But I'm a big fan of the Estes method that you all use. I'm
Yeah.
a big fan of the certain spirit boxes. Man, a lot of people turn up with those ghost hunting apps on
I
their
hate
phones,
those.
and I just don't know how on
No.
earth you can put any faith in those.
I'm with you.
Um,
We've been with so many people that just use them constantly.
I mean, if I didn't make it myself, I don't know how on earth you could assume it's anything but a random word generator.
Yeah.
Or it's listening to you and it knows you're at a
Right.
prison
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's gonna say trigger words.
What was the other thing? There was another thing I was going to say. Audio is always, of course, I'm a former radio guy. Audio is going to be my big focus anyway.
That's our
but
favorite.
That's really, so it sounds like,
Yeah.
pretty in sync with that
that'd be good.
stuff.
Yeah. And that's always the big test of a ghost hunter, isn't it? Is, how many audio recorders did I bring? Well, now you have to listen to 8 hours of audio that many times.
Yeah,
You
we
know,
gotta
and
get-
really
we
pay
need to get one
attention.
We
to
need
it.
to
more.
get at least one more,
We
yeah.
need to get at least one more
Yeah.
digital recorder because we really,
Well,
have,
Really need another camera too.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I've got a couple that I'll bring, and you're welcome to
Awesome.
double up on mine if you want. So,
Cool.
Yeah,
that's always, I usually have plenty of audio recorders, but,
Cool.
good.
so I don't know what else to recommend do you have a
That's
proton
about- I
pack?
mean, that's
Oh,
really
yeah.
what we use. So yeah, I was just kind of, yeah.
Yeah, we get any
You-
more, we forget about it.
Do you have a proton pack? Do you want?
Don't have one of those. We forget to use this guy. We both have one and we never remember to use the EMF detectors.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much faith I have in them anyways.
They just look cool.
They just
I
look
just keep
cool.
it on my desk because it looks fun.
Yeah. And you probably know to be careful around your cell phones with those and things like that.
Right.
And
And I think that's, a lot of it.
I think I can tell you where we know the electrical hotspots are.
Yeah.
That'll be good to know.
We'll see
Well,
what happens.
I hope they give you something. There'll be nights when just nothing happens. I mean, housing the old women's shed, I can tell you that place will go months with no activity, and then one night will just be off the rails.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We should
Like-
look up, is July 22nd like a full moon or something? There's theories on that makes a difference.
Which I
Oh,
think
Or a
sure. Yeah,
storm.
there's
It's
all
too far
kinds
away
of
to know if it's
theories.
gonna storm.
I always the people who are there, like, I want to be there at the witching hour, 3 a.m, and I'm always like, okay, well, do ghosts observe daylight savings time, or is it 3? Do they know it's 3 a.m. Central?
they keep
Like,
it very
which
detailed
time zone are we
calendar.
talking about? I don't know, but
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how much I buy into that per se, but
who knows?
who knows? Yeah.
Do you ever use music as a trigger?
We have.
We had,
Mhm.
not too much, but we have a couple
We
times.
tried. We were just kind of with a group that was a little bit too loud for it to work.
Yeah.
We tried like something to trigger it, and it just, so that's something I'd like to do to work on to do that more. We just need
The right circumstances.
silence.
Yeah.
Wise.
Well, one guy he gained national notoriety, maybe international, but certainly national notoriety while he was an inmate at MSP. And some of his music's on YouTube.
Okay.
So something we could do. His name is Harry Snodgrass. He was called the King of the Ivories.
Oh.
And the records that you'll find some recordings of on YouTube were recorded after he was an inmate here, but he
Yeah.
became famous here.
That'd be,
Uh,
that's a cool.
And so sometimes I'll play his music, seeing if that'll stir anything up.
Mhm.
But just I would encourage you before you're here, think of what music would have been played at
Yeah.
168 years of time periods and sprinkle some of it in here and there. And,
Yeah.
I mean,
Are there any other, like, other than music, like any other trigger objects or things you could think of that might be good to kind of?
people have tried, of course, a cigarette or a pack of cigarettes, but I don't know that that's ever, I think it's a good idea in a prison. It'd be something I'd tried, but after 13 years, I don't know of anybody ever getting any real results from that. Weirdly, I would have thought at least once or
Yeah.
twice we'd get one to move. It wouldn't hurt, but But I'm trying to think what else. I don't know if anybody's ever bought that I know of, or I've been there, brought a pack of ramen in. Because especially after they couldn't smoke anymore, ramen became one of the big currencies.
I always got that.
Yeah,
You know?
I've got some of
Yeah.
that on hand.
Bring a cat with saddlebags.
Hey, you want
Yeah, I've got a tortoiseshell.
but and try and think of I've never done this, but I always try to think too of what would they miss from home. How many times did they get a piece of mom's cherry pie, or I don't know, whatever it is that they. So I try to think of stuff that maybe they would,
Yeah,
but again, there's so many different time periods to be covered too.
true.
Yeah, that might be something to do a little bit of digging in just to find random things.
Yeah.
Nothing crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, then we can eat it.
Yeah, that's the best part.
Really piss them off.
Yeah. Would you like
Really?
a bite of this apple pie?
Too bad.
Yeah, we're just getting into taunting territory, which is not our
Yeah.
It's not exactly.
Here's something I haven't used on an investigation. I read about this. I've started using this on my tours in the last 7 or 8 months. But it's 1925, they finally started teaching the African American inmates to read. But even, not just the African American inmates, I think of how many inmates came there illiterate.
Yeah.
And it would have been all age groups. I mean, some guys might have showed up there 70 or 80 years old, not knowing how to read yet. And so I've wondered if there's a way I could capitalize on that in terms of some kind of a trigger or trigger object.
Yeah.
But I mean, that had to be an emotional thing the first time a 70-year-old man can read a letter from home or write one back. Or even, 20 or however many, whatever you want to go. But I mean, imagine the first time you can write a letter back home.
Yeah.
Some of these guys. So I'm trying to think of a way to capitalize on that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That could be.
Are there any card games or anything like that maybe something like that could be an interesting, maybe something more positive? I don't know.
I wonder if anybody has brought dominoes in there.
Okay.
I bet they, and of course they would bet on things too. But they would gamble over dominoes. They'd play cards. Just about any kind of sport you can think of was played sometimes, often competitively there. I mean, boxing was a huge thing in MSP for decades.
Shadow boxing.
But everything from shuffleboard to roller skating, volleyball, racquetball.
Wow. I don't even play sports with living people, so I'm not going to do that.
I've never done this before. It just occurred to me. One of the ways that people used to get drugs into that prison, because the racquetball courts were basically up against the outer wall. So you want to get a little bit of heroin or something in there, you cut open a racquetball, stick it inside, throw it over into the rec yard, and the guard comes and, the guy comes and picks it up the next day. Of course, the guards on the towers always knew to watch for that, but it never occurred to me to cut open a racquetball and stick something in it. I mean, I'm fresh out of heroin. I don't know about you two, but
my dealer
might have some by July.
Oregano. I don't know what do you put in it, but
kind of good heroin dupe.
But I'd be kind of curious to see if we put a racquetball in, especially one that we've cut open.
Yeah, because even a racquetball then at least is,
even if there's nothing in it, it's still trigger.
Yeah.
We've gotten interactions just doing kind of similar things before. So
with balls.
With balls,
Yeah.
Okay. That's some interesting ideas though. I like that.
Yeah.
I like having just a little bag of things to bring just if it's getting too quiet and try something.
If we can stir anything up if it's been a quiet night for us. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us.
Glad to do it. It's been a pleasure to talk to you too. I'm being a fanboy over here.
Well, likewise. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you. This was fun, and
we'll see you in a few weeks.
I know.
All right.
Wait.
Yeah.
All right. Y'all have a good night. Thank you.
Bye.
Harry M. Snodgrass, who gained fame as King of the Ivories while broadcasting from WOS, Jefferson City, Missouri, will play the Prisoner's Song.